Hello and welcome to another episode of the N64 Magazine Time Capsule. As always, this is the show where we take a chronological look at N64 Magazine to look back on what was the hottest news, reviews and information coming out in relation to the N64 from way back in the day. If it is your first time here, then if you pause a video at any point and you're viewing in HD, then you should be able to read on-screen text quite easily. Or alternatively, I'll link to the PDF scans courtesy of the Out of Print Archive, who do a wonderful job on retro magazine scans. Today's cover is one of the more eye-catching ones, as purple is a rarely used colour on the front of magazines. Issue 12 here is from February 1998 and it sees the import review teased of Yoshi's story and with some fresh artwork straight from Nintendo. Inside we're also teased with some Quake coverage as well as aero gauge and some import reviews. What's notable here though is that this is the post-Christmas issue, which was also a quiet period for the console, and so it's really scratching the barrel here with some of the coverage, as many of the games people were interested in would have been released in the Christmas rush. The back cover on the right here features a full-page advert for F1 Pole Position 64, which was actually one of the first racing games I remember trading in games to get hold of. Up next is a full-page ad for Mortal Kombat Annihilation with some cool logo artwork here, but sadly this was a 12 certificate movie, so I knew right away this wasn't going to be a gore fest that I'd been initially hoping for. The letter from the editor this month explains why of the 11 games being reviewed, 9 are import games, pretty much for the reason I mentioned before. A nice plug here is also made for the GoldenEye multiplayer guide, which was actually sent into the magazine by a fan. This is why I love the magazine so much, because it had such a great connection with its readers, and it wasn't afraid to showcase some of the awesome community members they had around. The contents page here is fairly standard this month, but what's interesting is that they say that Snowboard Kids is their favourite game of this month. For anyone thinking they had a typo here, Snowboard Kids is the Japanese name for Snowboard Kids. Also of note here is the top right corner where they have a coming soon section about games in development, and I can't think here what game they are showing, as it looks like a Frankenstein type monsters character. Mystical Ninja gets a lot of coverage here, as the magazine is thrilled to be detailing more about an English translation. If you watch my recent review of the game, you'll know that originally it was going to be a Japanese exclusive title, and so the magazine delves right into how the translation is coming along and when we can expect the game. I also love the sarcastic comments that the writers would accompany the game's on-screen shots with. It's a very dry sense of humour here, so it may not have appealed to everyone, but what I liked here was the breakdown to the full intro song of the game, explaining its Japanese quirks that would have been foreign to many readers of the time. Quake 64 gets a first time hands-on preview here from the lads at the magazine, and it's fair to say they were really excited about this one. They list 5 reasons why you should be excited about the game coming to N64, and one of them is the fact that you can blow somebody up with a grenade and then look at their severed head at your feet. Sadly though, they confirmed that Quake 64 would only be 2-player, and said the reason it wouldn't get 4-player support was due to the complexity of the levels. Now that sounded like some garbage being shilled by the developer, as we all know this is utter nonsense now. NBA Pro 98 is previewed here at around 70% completed state, and the magazine explains that whilst they love the arcade basketball games already on the system, this would be the first simulation one, and it was shaping up quite nicely. They also stated though that it looks to be missing many features like smoother graphics and commentary, that Nintendo's upcoming basketball game is likely to be tough competition for this one. Planet 64, which is the N64 news section, is up next, and this month it really feels like quite a quiet month for the magazine, and so instead the focus is more on hyping the upcoming games. Nintendo's official UK outlet, The Games, provided their release schedule for the rest of the year, which already included heavy hitters such as F-Zero X, Ocarina of Time and 1080 Snowboarding. You know it's interesting here to see so many games from 1998 which were absolute stellar lineup, and that's just onto the games coming through the official outlet. It doesn't even take into consideration many third-party games that would come out that year. They also mention here for the first time around the prices of older N64 games dropping to $40 in the US for the first time, and they joke that it would never happen here in the UK. It's a bit of a fanboy news here because they mention the console had been dominating in the States, which we know wasn't true, but what's interesting here is it was the first tease of the Player's Choice series of games. At the top of the shortcuts section, there's also news that a new gaming TV show called Games World was basically going into production. And so if anyone was interested in being on the show, they were taking applications, which they said was going to be similar to Games Master. For those in the know, none other than Larry Bundy Jr. was on the show when it ended up getting made. Over on the next set of pages you have something interesting N64 related accessories and ways to jazz up your console, but it's Retro World this month which will likely cause a bit of a disagreement, as they gave Metal Gear on the NES a measly 39% score and pretty much hated it. There is however a cool retrospective on the Atari links, and as always the Fanzine farm gives you this month's fanzines and addresses which you could order them from. I always appreciated how the magazine would use its reach to help increase subscribers for these, and in doing so create the next generation of games journalists. Planet 64 drops next with this month's previews of upcoming N64 games, and holy crap, this month is awesome. Firstly you have 1080 Snowboarding, then World Cup 98 and Wayne Gretzky 98, which, you know, they are what they are, but when you turn over you have F-Zero X, and interestingly, perhaps by mistake, they use the same screenshot twice in this very small article. Below however is Castlevania 64, and they said that since it was first teased in video form there hadn't been any new information or details for months, until this month's Konami magazine did a feature on it. They said that there were no screenshots which were new, however there was artwork around the game's 4 playable characters, with a little more information about them. It's interesting here because, as we know, we wouldn't get all 4 playable characters until the second N64 Castlevania. The WCW vs NWO World Tour advert here is also quite eye-catching, and it does show off some of the game's star power. RPG news section is up next, and it's always Fusoya has the latest info. What I realise more and more as I look back on this magazine is that having a section devoted to RPGs on a console which barely had any was actually quite funny. Saying that though, we did get some more brand new screenshots for Zelda here, but what piqued my interest was more Fusoya answering fans' questions. One in particular asked if the console would be getting a Neon Genesis game as they had heard rumours, to which Fusoya responded that the person asking the question probably hadn't heard any rumours but was instead trying to drum up interest for a Neon Genesis game. It's quite funny, as I guess the reader had the last laugh when they did eventually get a Neon Genesis N64 game. Albeit it was Japanese only, but regardless it was quite a good game to play as well. Okay, so as I write this script I'm also reading the magazine at the same time, and so I know now that the Green Frankenstein character that I mentioned right at the start of this video was for a cancelled game, and this is being shown here with the name Jest, and it was coming from Ocean. They said that information seems quite vague, but they expect the studio to be sending more information in the next month or so. However, they noted that the environments do look really nice, and so they had their interest piqued somewhat. There's also details for Biofreaks which they said could be, well, the best fighting game Midway puts out on the console after the mixed bag that has actually already been released. What's also interesting here comes with the Ear to the Ground section, which talks early details around Turok 2 and an RPG game called Dragon Storm, which was in development by Interactive here in the UK. The Ultra release list as always teased the upcoming games release dates, and I always love looking at this section to see just how many games were in development that either had big name changes or were never released at all. From Legion X to Space Jelly to Street Fighter 64 to Tornado, there were simply so many to get hyped about here. You also get the sales charts at the bottom from across the world, as well as the magazine's own waiting list for games they were most hyped about. Interestingly, already at this point there were 2 games in their top 10 list that would never arrive, and they were Mother 3 and Jungle Emperor Leo. Max Everingham, who's the magazine's man in Japan this month, gives an overview of the Japanese arcade scene, which I was never too interested in to be honest, but he did mention that Fire Electric Pen had been a bit of a sensation in Japan, and the game show it's based on had promoted the game and sales had been quite popular. He also mentioned that the analog stick was an ideal way to play this game, and it helped to show off some of the controller's positive aspects. N64 Arena gives us 2 PAL release reviews this month, and then also a huge number of import reviews, so there's plenty to get stuck into. If you're wondering why the photos of the reviewers are all in strange colours at the bottom there, then have a read of their bios which explains why they all seem to be coloured like a bag of Skittles. WCW vs NWO World Tour is up next, and they devote 8 pages to this game and go into great detail on it, including an overview of its full roster. What's the problem here, however, is that whilst they did give the game a respectable 70% rating, they weren't actually wrestling fans at this time. They went to the trouble of creating a review of every character, including how to pull off their special moves, but many of these are completely wrong and show they really didn't know what they were talking about. As an example, they list Hollywood Hulk Hogan's finisher as a chokehold, which anyone who's seen Hulkster at any point in his career knows that was never his finishing move. That aside though, they did a fair job talking about the game's technical abilities. It's a shame because little did they know how incredible and how many great wrestling games would come to the N64, but at least at this point it was a start for wrestling games on the console. Nagano Winter Olympics is up, and whilst I love the artwork and page layouts here, well, let's be honest, they do look awesome, the game sadly gets torn to pieces. I remember thinking this game might still be worth a try despite this terrible review, and so I do remember picking it up one time and quickly realising it was actually as bad as they made it out to be. Although there is actually nothing like it on the N64, so it does have that novelty factor. What lightens up the review is their snooze meter, which takes some of the 12 of the winter events in the game and ranks them based on how many Z's they're likely to give that event. The top one being skating, as it simply was a case of pressing the 2 shoulder buttons in sequence and that was all. The next 12 pages are an import review of Yoshi's story, and it's fair to say that the magazine really enjoyed this one. The review itself is detailed and they break down many of the nuances of gameplay and what type of levels you can find in each of the game's storybook pages. They were very clear here, however, that the game didn't score 90% plus because of the fact it is too easy for newcomers. But they did say that for experienced gamers, even the exploration elements and finding all the secrets would not be too difficult. They were fair, however, in saying that the purpose of the game was to try and open up to a wider range of players, and so having a game which is easier for newcomers to complete is a requirement of the game that they were going for, but also having enough depth to justify the price was also needed. After the review, they wrapped things up with a little overview of Yoshi's appearances in video games to help bring anyone up to speed who perhaps isn't aware of the character's history, which was a cool, nice touch to see, and it is actually quite informative. Jonathan Nash gets to review Tamagotchi World 64, and it's fair to say the review has aged like the plague, because the score of 79% is quite honestly insane. Whilst even he admitted it was perhaps a 77% game, it was bumped up to 79% because the game is quite well paced, and I think still that is just nuts. He does mention, however, that the game's controls and how it works are all illustrated in game, and so there shouldn't be any issues for any import players who don't speak Japanese, as it's all self-explanatory using the game's imagery. Dual Heroes is up next, and it gets slated, and the writer can't understand how the N64 is getting such bad fighting games, aside from Mace the Dark Age, which at that point was still the console's best fighting game. When it comes to explaining how a Westerner would get on with an import copy of this game, he suggests that the virtual player mode would prove difficult, but if you have the game on import then that's the least of your worries. Tokon Road was a case of bad timing, as the game being reviewed in the same issue of WCW vs NWO World Tour, and it's clear which of these two is the better game. The score is probably fair in my opinion, and from an import perspective they said it shouldn't prove too difficult because although there is a lot of Japanese text in the game, once you get into the action in the ring it's pretty self-explanatory. The next 5 pages are devoted to Snowboard Kids, and seeing this just brings back memories flooding to me. You may recall about 1 or 2 issues ago the magazine had played it at Space World and they thought it was terrible. But now they had received the import full version of the game, they realised that whilst they'd been at Space World, the game had been stuck in its stunt mode, and so they hadn't actually experienced the full game. They were excited that Nintendo had picked up the translation rights, and so they were confident the release would be a success. They ended up saying that the game sits somewhere between Mario Kart 64 and Diddy Kong Racing. It's not as good as Mario Kart in single player, but in multiplayer it's better than DKR, which I think makes sense and is probably how I'd position it too. Robotron gets a single page review here, and the gist of the review is that whilst the game's bloody good, it doesn't quite realise its potential, and so there are parts of the game which left the reviewer yearning for just a little bit more. He applauds the fact that even at level 90 the game still threw out new surprises and enemies to keep the game feeling fresh, and as a retro update to a classic franchise it does enough to warrant a purchase. Art of Fighting Twin gets a positive review here, with the reviewer applauding the game's history from the Super Nintendo era and praising the fact that the game essentially has two different styles in both 2D and 3D that make it very good value for money, with neither mode being perfect, but he ends up saying that the 2D mode especially has so much depth with the item collection that it was really shaping up to be a decent game. Aero Gauge gets one of the most savage reviews ever in the history of the magazine here, with its 10% score, which I found hilarious. In fact, the review even states that the studio must have studied the history of racing games and attempted to compile the list with the worst ones ever made to create something this bad. It gets torn to shreds, and it's summed up best when the reviewer also asks, why does this game even exist? Fire Electric Pen is on the right hand side here, and it gets a fair review. I mean, come on, it's a niche game, and so it was never going to be a Star Award review game, but the review does a good job selling its benefits and explaining why that despite the game being one which will drive you insane, it will keep you coming back and again for more and more punishment. The reviewer calls the game an expensive novelty, but one which he very much likes, and I think that's a quite fair assessment. The next 6 pages are a really detailed guide on how to import games and what equipment you would need and so on. I actually remember referencing this guide back in the day as a kid on how to get some games I really wanted early. They also review a specialist import game company about what type of person they are finding that they're importing games for. And they said they're generally importing games for males between age 20 to 35 who have a high disposable income, are early adopters of the console who want the latest games before anyone else, and I think that's exactly spot on to much of the retro gaming community now if my channel statistics are anything to go by. I didn't notice until the end that Next Generation Consoles was actually a game store in the city where I now live. Sadly though, it must have closed down many years ago, but they even put the address, and so I looked it up and it's actually now been turned into something which resembles a pizza shop, but I couldn't quite tell from Google Street View. Anyway, I get messages all the time about import N64 stuff, and so this is still the article I reference people to go research from time to time. A couple of the regular how-to guides up now, and the first up is NFL Quarterback Club 98, and if you're the one person in the world who's still playing this game, then it may be of interest to you, but to anyone else watching and listening to this, then I think we should swiftly move on to the next guide. And that's because Extreme G is much more relevant, and the guide is actually okay here. I mean, it's more of an overview, I would say, on the different bikes and weapons as opposed to a full-on track breakdown guide I would have expected, but the weapons information is actually quite useful, and it does a much better job than the game's manual on explaining things here. The best guide, however, comes from the reader who sent in their GoldenEye guide to the magazine for publication. The magazine would actively advertise to readers to send in their guides, and they send them gift packs etc. in returns if they publish their guides. This one does have a little bit of Tim Weaver's tips thrown in here, but for the best part it's completely written by the fan of the magazine. For any deathmatch fans here, this guide on how many hits you'd need to land on which body parts with every gun is very useful, and you can tell this chap must have put a phenomenal amount of time and effort to get to this level of detail. Tips Extra this month focuses on Diddy Kong Racing, and for some reason I don't have any memory of this section, because if I did I wouldn't have found WizPig so much harder than I actually did. There's also readers' tips here which are quite cool, and the ones for the 2-player Shadows of the Empire mode is quite unique here, and it shows how avid gamers of the time were already finding ways to try and get games working in ways that they weren't intended to be. I'm the Best this month has, well, this month's leaderboards for readers who'd sent in their confirmed proof of achievements along with scores and details of their times. Maybe one day I'll figure out how to do a video around this because I have a feeling it could be quite a cool idea. Club 64 answers readers' letters which had been sent in. Now, there's a quite funny one here from a kid who said his school is going careers mad, and so he wants to know how he can become an N64 game reviewer. But his dad is telling him that they don't make much money, so as you can imagine the response in the magazine here is also quite funny as well. Dream On also has readers' ideas for games, and the one for Snooker 64 actually perfectly explains how the analog stick could be used in the game, and that ended up being the exact same way it worked in Virtual Pool 64 sometime later. In addition, the idea for Sharp 64, based off the TV show Sharp starring Sean Bean, was perhaps really dating the age of this magazine now. If you subscribe to N64 Magazine, you'll get a free Trident 64 controller, which is probably the worst incentive to sub to the magazine ever. Rounding off the magazine comes a few pages of the directory, which gives every game score so far from previous issues that had been reviewed. And closing off the magazine is the details that the next magazine will be the first birthday issue of N64. So, what many people didn't see was that there was also an announcement that the magazine was getting a brand new editor as Jonathan had left. This was the last issue of this era in the magazine's history, because many fans will say that it's from issue 13 onwards when the magazine really hits its stride and becomes the best magazine of its generation. So, until then, I hope you've enjoyed this trip down memory lane as much as I have, and I promise I won't keep you waiting so long before we get to the next issue. But as always, thanks for watching, and until next time.